Okay, so this is Paul Pavao, and this is my video on apostolic succession. I've already done one on apostolic tradition, which is a different thing, but which will be covered in this video as well because it's crucial to understanding what apostolic succession is. So I am arguing that apostolic succession has much more to do with the preservation of truth than it does with any authority on behalf of the person who's in the apostolic succession. For example, I don't know all the exact lineages of the early Roman succession, but I do know that Irenaeus shows Clement as the third bishop of Rome, and Tertullian shows him as the second, or maybe even the very first. We'll look at that today. But the Orthodox and the Catholics would say that there is some authority, some right to rule, some right to represent the people that is included in apostolic succession. And while I do not completely deny this, especially in the way that the Eastern Orthodox understand it, I certainly deny the claim that apostolic succession is a reason for the Pope to have authority over all the churches in the world. I wrote a book against that. It's called Rome's Audacious Claim. The name of it will be down in the description below. That's not true. But let's talk about what apostolic succession is. And to do so, I'm going to share my screen with you. So the first thing I want to show you is how you can get to these things on your own computer. So this is my browser. I'm gonna start this window over. So I go to CCEL, that stands for Classic Christian Ethereal Library.org/fathers. You get a page that looks like this. So there's a 38 volume set of the pre-Nicene, the Nicene, and the post-Nicene fathers, and you can see them all listed here. Used to be you had to pay at least $300 to get these in hardback. I got all of them for I don't remember what in PDF format. The last I saw, Christian Classics Ethereal Library was selling the PDFs for like $2.50. So I use the PDFs on my computer, but if you wanted to go check something that I wrote, you'd go find out what volume that, you can look through these names. Probably on this video, you can't even see those names. They're very small. But I will be covering in volume 1, which I'm not sure what this next page is for, except to kind of introduce the volume. I just always click on the book and move on. So what happens is that up here, you have the contents of that first volume. And I'm going to be reading from Irenaeus, who's here, and from Against Heresies, book 1 and book 3. And like when I go to book 1, it's going to be in chapter 10. You can just scroll down. Here's chapter 10, and you can find what I was reading. You can also read them in a little bit different way at earlychristianwritings.com. So if you go there, let me see if I can move this out of the way. Okay. If you go there, my browser rejects this search function here and says that it's not right. I don't know what's wrong with it. So I use Control F. And if I want to find Irenaeus, I can go here to Irenaeus of Lyon. It gives the dates that he wrote. And then these are the things that you can read. Here's his Against Heresies. It's a 5-volume book. And so if I wanted to go read book 1, it's all on one page. So if you wanted chapter 10, you'd have to hit Control F again and look for, let's see how they have it listed, chapter 10. So here it is, and you'd find what I'm reading. So I always find this is easiest, and I put this link right here down in the bottom of my videos. So I'm not making these things up. This isn't some weird thing. the Apostolic Fathers and the early Church Fathers, they're well known. People rely on them and trust them. These are the Christians of the 2nd and 3rd century when you look at the pre-Nicene Fathers, because pre-Nicene means before the Council of Nicaea, which happens in 325. Okay, so if you already know all this, that was probably rather condescending. So let me stop the screen sharing. Actually, let me click new share. And let's go to my Adobe Acrobat and we'll be reading from there. So here's what apostolic succession is. Let's go to chapter 3 here. Okay, so this is the chapter that the Catholics really love. I don't object to the way that the Eastern Orthodox use this idea of apostolic succession, at least not very much. So here's part of Irenaeus's argument against heresies, and this is from around the year 185. And suffice it to say that the heresies he's refuting is Gnosticism. They teach a completely different God from the Christians while trying to teach that out of the scriptures. I have pages on what the Gnostics believed. It's just horrific. So there's no wondering about whether they were the true Christians or anything like that. So in the process of refuting these Christians, and he launches into a discussion of a succession of bishops and a succession of elders in the churches. So the succession of elders is up here in the preface. He says, but again, when we refer them, that's the Gnostics, the heretics, to that tradition which originates from the apostles. And in my apostolic tradition video, I talk about that apostolic tradition is simply the faith that was once for all delivered to the state, to the church, to the saints, I mean. Sorry. And that tradition was to be kept unchanged. The apostles taught the gospel, taught the whole faith to the churches, and it was the job of the churches, and especially of their leaders, as it says here, to preserve that unchanged. So he says, when we refer those heretics to that tradition which originates from the apostles and which is preserved by means of the succession of presbyters in the churches, they object to tradition, saying that they themselves are wiser not merely than the elders, presbyters it says here, but that means elders, but even than the apostles, because they have discovered the unadulterated truth. If that you discover an unadulterated truth that the God of the Bible did not create the universe, it is a very adulterated truth. And he's going to argue for that. But he says, first of all, we refer them to the apostolic tradition that we have preserved in our churches, the teaching of the apostles, because the apostles are the authority of Christianity. And I've done a video on that talks about the authority of the apostles. This is what the early church said. This is where the scriptures came from, that they went, anything the apostles teach is inspired. The apostles gave us the faith. We're holding on to their faith. So if we find anything that the apostles or even apostolic men, and you'll learn that term a little later in this video, or even apostolic men teach, then we want to have that writing. We want to preserve it. We want to read it in the churches so that people understand the apostolic tradition better. So tradition, there is a tradition about tradition. The tradition about tradition is, if the tradition came from the apostles, it is authoritative for Christians and for the church. And since the scriptures, the New Testament scriptures, come from the apostles, even the ones that are written not by apostles are written by apostolic men. Mark traveled with Peter when he wrote his gospel. Luke had traveled with Paul. He wrote a gospel. They are apostolic men, and so the church held on to what they wrote. The same with James. He wasn't one of the original apostles, but he was the Lord's brother, and he was hanging out with Peter and John, leading the church in Jerusalem for a very long time. He was involved in the council in Acts 15 between the Gentiles regarding how does the church preach the gospel to the Gentiles, how does the law of Moses relate to the Gentiles. He was involved in that. So what he writes, the church wants to know because he is one of the apostolic men. So, okay, so that's just the point I wanted to make here. It's preserved by means of the succession of elders in the churches. It's not just bishops, it's elders. And the point of bringing up a succession is to show preservation. It's not so much to show, the Church of Corinth has a succession that goes back to the apostles. The church in Alexandria has a succession that goes back to Mark. The churches in India have a succession that goes back to Thomas. And so, therefore, they have some kind of domineering jurisdictional authority. No, the authority they have is because they have preserved the truth that comes from the apostles. You teach the truth to the saints obey the truth, and together they exhort one another, build one another up. And the church is a matter of, sorry about that, probably should silence my phone before doing videos. The church is a matter of building one another up in obeying Jesus, in obeying the faith, in walking in the apostolic tradition, which is the faith once for all delivered to the saints. That's the primary point. So I'm going to just jump down here because that really covers a lot of what I would have wanted to say before doing this. So here's really the first time that someone presents apostolic succession as something important, and it's Irenaeus. He's very important. He himself has some sort of apostolic succession because he was a student of Polycarp. He was in Polycarp's church anyway in his younger years in Smyrna. And Polycarp was almost certainly appointed by apostles, which is, he's a secondary link to the apostles. So he says, "It is within the power of all, therefore, in every church who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world." Now, notice his focus on the tradition of the apostles. This is what is important, not making sure that every Tom, Dick, and Harry is subject to the Bishop of Rome or the Bishop of Corinth or to, in this day, there's only one church. So if you're in Corinth and you're not in some way connected to the bishop and elders in Corinth who are preserving the apostolic tradition, teaching you about the apostles, you don't have a Bible that you can go down to the bookstore and read in the year 185. You just don't. You don't have a copy of any of the scrolls, probably. But your church does. And they read them to you. That's one of the primary, there's in 1 Timothy 5, I think that's where it is. Paul says, give attention to the public reading of Scripture. Now, we don't necessarily give attention to that anymore because everybody can go down to a Christian bookstore or go to the library and read the whole Bible for themselves. But in 185, you couldn't. So one of the big jobs of the churches was to read the Scriptures in the church, and not just some collected readings. No, you had to read enough that the people could get everything you had from the apostles plus the Old Testament with some expounding from your teachers who have been trained from teachers before them in the truth that was handed down from the apostles. So that's all very important. I'm sorry for the amount of time I'm taking up, but I just don't think this can be done shorter. So we're in a position to reckon up those who are by the apostles. That's the third highlighted line there, who are by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, and to demonstrate the succession of these men to our own times, those who neither taught nor knew of anything like what these heretics rave about. So again, the point is the preservation of truth. He's talking about things they taught or knew, not who they ruled over. Okay, in this day, yes, the bishop was kind of, whatever sense, over the in Rome, over the whole city of Rome, but he would add a lot of elders to help shepherd the people. We need shepherds in the church, and especially gifted shepherds. And most of these shepherds would have been appointed by the church itself after growing up in the faith in the midst of the church. So if you're an elder in the Church of Rome or the Church of Corinth, or even in the Church of Derby, in one of those churches that was first founded by Paul, a little town, if you're an elder there, you probably either grew up in the church or you were saved and had been a Christian for at least 5, 6, 10 years, and people went, no, you understand the faith, you live it out, we respect you, we want you to shepherd us, we see that gift in you, you're a good father to your family, you can be a good father to us. And I'm not saying you should call bishops father, but I am saying that what shepherds do for sheep is a lot like what fathers do for children. And that's the reason that the Apostle Paul would tell Timothy and Titus to make sure that the elders they appoint are good fathers, that they've raised children who believe. So, okay, so he's talking about, I can show a line of bishops, and it's not just the bishops, it's also the elders who are passing down the apostolic succession to the next generation. So then he kind of defends some of the arguments that they make against that the heretics make against the apostles. And so, well, here we should read this top line. So, for they, the apostles, were desirous that these men, the elders and bishops that they appointed, should be very perfect and blameless in all things, whom also they were leaving behind as their successors, delivering up their own place of government to these men, which men, if they discharge their functions honestly, would be a great boon to the church, but if they should fall away, the direst calamity. So, again, their main job is to preserve the apostolic succession. Irenaeus says government here. I'm not going to argue against that, okay? Bishops and elders in shepherding the church, there is some act of governing. I know a lot of people deny that, especially Protestants, but we need shepherds who can do things like admonish a heretic once or twice and then reject him. And someone's got to be able to do that, and that can't just be by church vote. I can tell you from experience that can be a nightmare. No, you've got to have elders who are in a situation to judge things like that, to put out the heretic from among you. And the church should be involved in rejecting sinners, but you need you need someone in a place of government and shepherding, pastoring, being an elder. There is some governing involved. So anyway, he says government, that's a good thing. I'm sorry I spent so much time on that. Let's move on. So, since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches. So he's about to cover Rome, not because that's the only succession that matters, but because it would be ridiculous to go through all of the successions of bishops in all the churches. Okay, so I'm going to stop rushing so I stop stumbling over my words. Let's read this next section. It's important. Since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches, we do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. So the Gnostics love to hold unauthorized meetings because they love to slip into the church and then find weak people, pull them off on the side, because it's a lot easier to do that and get away with it than it would be in 2022. Much, much, much easier. So that's what they were doing. They're holding these meetings off on the side. Not only that, in that culture, You got a house on the edge of town. All you got to do is hang a shingle above your door that says, I'm a teacher. I can teach you math. I can teach you this, and people will come to you. I can teach you Christianity, and people will come to you. Well, if you do that without ever telling the bishop and the elders who know what the apostolic tradition is that you're doing such, you have assembled an unauthorized meeting, and you shouldn't. And so he goes, so I hope you can see this. All right, I'm like highlighting. So I'm gonna um, put to confusion these unauthorized meetings by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. Now, actually, neither one of them founded Rome. By the time Paul wrote to Rome, Peter was probably not already there. There were already churches there, or at least Christians there. He doesn't refer to the church in Rome when he writes to them. He just writes to the saints in Rome, the holy ones in Rome. And then he came later, and Peter came even later than that. But Peter stayed and functioned as an elder there, and eventually was killed there. So it was the Roman church was founded and organized by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the successions of the bishops. So the faith that is preached has been brought down to our time by both the elders and the bishops. He said elders a little earlier, and they are preserving the apostolic tradition. So he says, for it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolic tradition has been preserved continuously by those who exist everywhere. So there's a couple of things here. It's a very weird sentence on its surface, much less the difficulty in how this would really make Catholics happy and Protestants unhappy. But its point, I think, if you look at this, is pretty evident. And the point is that the Roman church, founded by Peter and Paul and holding on to the truth, is not only the most preeminent authority on what is the apostolic tradition because of Peter and Paul, but also because the faithful everywhere that are preserving the apostolic tradition all over the Roman Empire and even in barbarian lands and even east of the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire in India, a lot of them are crisscrossing through Rome, and thereby there's some feedback and unity among these churches. So Rome, as every road leads to Rome, is a preeminent authority on what is true. Now, I want to remind you that this book is called Against Heresies. He's trying to teach the church in Rome, and yeah, he's trying to teach the church in Rome and the bishop there about how to deal with these Gnostics. The first two books tell them what the Gnostics taught, and then these rest of them, this is how you deal with them. Okay, so first, the apostolic succession of the bishops and elders in the church in Rome is just an awesome model for preservation, as well as in the first chapter. I guess I'll have to go back there and show you that. In the first chapter, he talks about the unity of all the churches. This is proof, he says, that there is only one apostolic tradition, and it's not what you heretics have. It's what us churches have. So then he gives the lineage of Rome. And he says, first there was Linus, and then there was Anacletus, and then there was Clement. And so then he goes on down, and rather than listing all of these, he has some things to say about Clement in his letter through here. So there are more names: Anicetus, Sor, and now Eleutherius does now in the 12th place from the apostles hold the inheritance of the episcopate. So episcopate means bishop, the position of bishop. In this order and by this succession, the ecclesiastical tradition from the apostles and the preaching of the truth have come down to us. And this is the most abundant proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith, which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now and handed down in truth. So I want to point out that this succession is an argument that the church in Rome holds the truth. And he's about to argue that the church in Smyrna and the church in Ephesus hold the truth as well. He is not trying to go, you can't have a church unless it has this succession. He's going, this succession is proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith that has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now and handed down in truth. We have not changed what the apostles taught. That is what was important to Irenaeus. So then he goes in the next chapter, he talks about Polycarp, who was appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna. And, then he says, I saw him in my early youth, for he tarried on earth a very long time. Then he goes down to all these things, the Asiatic churches, that would be the churches around Ephesus, testify, as do also those men who have succeeded Polycarp down to the present time. So he goes through all of that. He has some discussions about who Polycarp is. So then he gets down to the bottom. He says, then again, the church in Ephesus, founded by Paul, and having John remaining among them permanently until the times of Trajan, is a true witness of the tradition of the apostles. So apostolic succession is primarily a true witness to the tradition of the apostles. Now, as we look at apostolic succession down through the ages to our time, you can trust Irenaeus. It's not even been 100 years since James died. Not even 100 years. And these bishops in all these churches have all done their best to hold on to the truth handed to them by the apostles. 100 years down the road, yes, it matters that there was Linus and there was Clement and there was Eleutherius. It matters knowing who handed down to who. But listen, after 2,000 years, especially when a doctrine comes in that says, oh, I'm the supreme bishop of the whole world. These words are in the Catholic Catechism. I have full, supreme, and universal power over the whole church. I can make decrees that change doctrines. They're called papal bulls. I can sit in my throne and go, Mary ascended into heaven. Mary was, her body was just, caught up into heaven. Mary didn't sin through her whole life. I can say that because I'm the Bishop of Rome. No, this has nothing to do with giving that kind of authority to the Bishop of Rome. It has to do with saying, look at this lineage. And all these people are in Rome, and Peter and Paul founded them. They are a tremendously powerful witness to the truth. And in my last video, I mentioned this, I'll mention it again. 70 years later, Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, would be exchanging letters to the church in Rome. And this is important because Rome was an apostolic church, Carthage was not. Where was the nearest apostolic church to Carthage other than Rome? Probably in Alexandria, which is far, far, far further than Rome. When you're in Carthage, Italy's just a jaunt across a narrow part of the Mediterranean Sea. So Rome is their closest apostolic church. That matters to Irenaeus. Actually, it's Tertullian who's in Carthage. Irenaeus is in Gaul, but same thing. He's in France. If you want to find an apostolic church other than Rome, you got to go past Rome to Greece, past Italy to Greece, and find Philippi or Corinth. But so this is where Irenaeus would have his main interaction. His main interaction would be with the church in Rome, because the church in Rome is the nearest apostolically formed church. Over time, the bishops of such churches would gain a great deal of power. But for right now, just suffice it to say that apostolic succession is primarily an argument about faithfully preserving the truth that was passed down from the apostles, and that trying to argue that having however many hundreds of bishops there have been since the first century in Rome is proof that they have the truth is, of course, a ridiculous argument, especially take into account some of the awful people that have been in that position. In my book, Rome's Audacious Claim, I cover just how awful the 10th and 11th centuries were as far as the papal, the popes were, as basically they were under the control of petty Italian families. And I borrowed that wording from a Catholic historian. Later, a rift between some of the cardinals, which there wasn't even such an office when this was written. Later, a rift between cardinals would result in the Bishop of Rome not even, being the Pope being elected in Avignon, France. And there was no Bishop of Rome during that time. And then later they brought it back to Rome, but then they made a Pope in Avignon as well. And then there were two popes. And then there was a early 1400s council where an emperor forced the Catholic Church to straighten out their problem. And so they appointed a third pope. And the Pope from Rome agreed to resign because the council asked him to. The Pope in Avignon locked himself in a castle for the rest of his life. With that kind of succession, these arguments just don't apply. You're not holding on to the truth through men like that. So anyway, that's my comment about apostolic succession from Irenaeus. I do want to read you some stuff on this in chapter 36 of Tertullian's prescription against heresies. So I mentioned, pay attention to the fact that Irenaeus's book is called Against Heresies. Tertullian's book is called The Prescription Against Heresies. Both of them are writing against heresies. They are presenting apologetic arguments. Apostolic succession was, in the late 2nd century, a very powerful apologetic argument that the church in Rome, that the church in Corinth, that the church in Alexandria, that the church in Philippi, that they had the truth of the apostles. And it was not just their apostolic succession, but also their unity that testified. As a matter of fact, I'm going to read you something in here. Let's go back and find that. I think it's in 32, but it might be in 28. No, not 32. Let's go back to 28. Sure hope this is not way back in 21. Okay, so here it is in 28. So first of all, I highlighted the Vicar of Christ because he calls the Holy Spirit the Vicar of Christ, not the Bishop of Rome. Tertullian is writing just maybe 15 years after Irenaeus in the year around the year 200. So he makes this argument: is it likely that so many churches, and they so great, should have gone astray into one and the same faith? No casualty distributed among many men issues in one and the same result. Error of doctrine in the churches must necessarily have produced various issues. When, however, that which is deposited among many is found to be one and the same, it is not the result of error, but of tradition. So his point is that if you go to Germany, and then you go to Israel, and then you go to Greece, and then you go to North Africa, and then you go to Italy, and then you go to France, and you find out that in all those places, the churches are teaching the same thing. And how can you argue that they went astray right after the apostles? If they went astray right after they all went astray into the exact same teaching, that doesn't make any sense. That's what he's arguing right there. And really, that's what I would argue to people say you can't trust the early church fathers. No, you can't trust the modern ones. It's been 2,000 years, yes, and they have gone astray into various errors. But really, for the Orthodox, it's not that much. I don't agree with them on calling elders priests. I don't agree with them on the function of the elders. I don't agree with them on the bishops and elders wearing such gaudy robes and having such grand honorific titles. I definitely don't agree with, bowing down to images of old saints. They're kind of cartoonish, so they're not exact images to help prevent idolatry. But the point is, if you're bowing down to pictures of saints, I'm sorry, that's going to produce idolatry. I was raised in the Catholic Church, and I can tell you that the statues there cause lots and lots of idolatry. That's just really not undeniable, not deniable. I'm not going to even argue for that. So anyway, the point of apostolic succession has to do with the same truth being all the churches. So let's get back down here to, let me use this and get back down to chapter 36. So, okay. So first of all, we're stopping here in 32. First of all, Tertullian says that these heretics, the same heretics that Irenaeus is talking about, they're later than they have origins. He goes, I know who these people are. I know what era they're from. They're like from the middle of the 2nd century. They're not from the 1st century. They're not from the apostles. He goes, so if any of these heretics want to be bold enough to plant themselves in the midst of the apostolic age, that they may thereby seem to have been handed down by the apostles because they existed in the time of the apostles. If they try to claim that, then we say, let them produce the original records of their churches. Let them unfold the role of their bishops, running down in due succession for the beginning, in such a manner that the first bishop of theirs shall be able to show for his ordainer and predecessor some one of the apostles or of apostolic man, a man moreover who continued steadfast with the apostles. So then he goes down in this section here. But even if they should pull this off, effect the contrivance, they will not advance a step, because their doctrine, compared with that of the apostles, will declare by its own diversity and contrariety that it has for its author neither an apostle nor an apostolic man. Okay, so basically, because their doctrine differs from what we know to be the truth of the apostles and the tradition that was handed down, we can just go, bye-bye, you guys. Your doctrine disqualifies you as an apostolic church. So then he makes a point that there's still churches being formed that don't have a roll back to the apostles, but instead they can show that they derived from an apostolic church, because churches are being planted all the time around the year 200. So he says, to this test, therefore, will the heretics be submitted for proof by those churches who, although they derive not their founder from the apostles or apostolic men, as being of much later date, for they are in fact being founded daily, yet since they agree in the same faith, they are accounted as not less apostolic, because they're akin in doctrine, because they're relatives in doctrine, because they hold to the same teaching. Then let all the heresies, when challenged to these two tests, whether they have a roll back to the apostles or whether their teachings are the same as the apostles, when they're challenged by our apostolic church, offer their proof of how they deem themselves to be apostolic. He goes, you guys just aren't apostolic. Okay, a little further down. So that's a big thing for Protestants. If you can show that your teaching is the same as the apostles, then you can say you're an apostolic church ordained by the apostles and apostolic men if your teaching matches theirs. But the fact is that most Protestant churches think that the early church fathers were wrong. And these guys are going, well, here's why we think we're right. Late 2nd century. By then, you can read through so many writings before them, including Irenaeus's 5-book tome. You can read through all those things and know exactly what these guys taught. And modern churches, most Protestant churches look back and go, they were wrong. Now, I'm not, actually the Church of Christ doesn't, but Baptist churches, Pentecostal churches, and even churches that call themselves apostolic churches, those apostolic churches hold to a doctrine about the Trinity that would have gotten them kicked out. As a matter of fact, there was a man named Sabellian in the early 3rd century, I think, who got kicked out because of holding the same doctrine about the Trinity that apostolic churches, the denomination apostolic, teaches now. And Tertullian writes against another guy who was also put out of the church for his teaching about the Trinity, and it was the same false teaching about the Trinity that's taught in apostolic and in United Pentecostal churches. The point is, if you're going to be claim to be a church following the teachings of the apostles, and Jesus's teaching were given to the apostles, go look at my apostolic tradition video, then you need to show that you agree with these guys, with Irenaeus, with Tertullian. You can't call them heretics. They're the originals. They're going, hey, we are holding to the original faith handed down to the saints. Here's our proofs for it. If you can't answer those proofs, or if you can't offer something better, then your claim that you are following the scriptures, when in fact that there are, there's thousands of on the record denominations, but there's not really thousands and thousands of beliefs. It's more like several hundred different variant Bible-only churches that disagree with one another, that have divided over something, even though it's in the Bible. So you can't just tell us, oh, well, I understand the Bible, I'm saying what's in the Bible, so I'm right. No, the Bible is misinterpreted all the time. And these guys have the teaching of the apostles to use to interpret the Bible. And, and I can tell you, for me, here's my experience. I saw the division when I became a Protestant in 1982. I got saved. I joined an Assemblies of God church. I was also attending Church of God in Christ, which is a mostly Black church. And I had Bible studies with all sorts of people in various denominations. And when I saw the arguments in the division, I went, I've got to start over. I got to figure out some way to read the Bible in an unbiased manner. So I started reading it, and pretty much I was welcome in a lot of those churches, but nobody agreed with me. Nobody would let me say the things that I wanted to say based on what was in the scriptures. And then one day I found a book on the early church fathers, and I found out that for the most part, that book was called Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up? And I found out I have drawn from the scriptures almost exactly the same doctrines that these early church fathers teach. So I want to say that you can find, even without reading the early church fathers, you can find their teachings in the Bible. And if you will push away Protestant tradition, Reformation tradition, Catholic tradition, I certainly wasn't reading it by Catholic tradition. The Catholics didn't teach me anything while I was growing up. And you push aside all those traditions, you just read the Bible, you will come up with something much different than most churches, just starting with the fact that all of us will one day stand before the Lord to be judged according to our works. So yes, we're saved. The good works come from the fact that we're born again. We have, by grace, through faith, we have been saved apart from works, and so that none of us can boast. And then we were created in Christ Jesus to do good works. And then he gave us the scriptures, so that with the scriptures, we could be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Second Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 through 17 says that. Titus chapter 2, verse 14 says that Jesus died to purchase for himself his own special people, zealous for good works. Now, if he's done all that for us, why should it be surprise us that we'll be judged for our works on the last day? Now, or the tradition that God requires perfection from people in order to consider them righteous. That is absolutely not true, cannot be taught from the Bible. And again, I've got other videos on these things, so maybe I should get back on track. So this is a great ending to this. Tertullian says, come now, you who would indulge a better curiosity. He's been talking leading up to this, going, don't let your curiosity and your seeking lead you into seeking outside the apostolic faith. We have the faith. Pursue all you want inside the faith. Study the scriptures, speculate, think about things, but never depart from the apostolic faith, because the apostles are the place where we stand. They delivered the faith once for all to the saints. So come now, you who want to indulge your curiosity. If you would apply it to the business of your salvation, run over to the apostolic churches, in which the very thrones, that can be chairs, of the apostles are still preeminent in their places, in which their own authentic writings are read, uttering the voice and representing the face of each of them severally. Achaia is very near you. You find Corinth. Since you are not far from Macedonia, you have Philippi. You have the Thessalonians. Since you were able to cross to Asia, Asia is West Turkey, and it's right across the Aegean Sea from Greece. Since you were able to cross to Asia, you get Ephesus. Since, moreover, you were close upon Italy, you have Rome, from which there comes even into our own hands. Now, they have the very authority of apostles themselves. They added the of apostles themselves. That's why it's in parentheses. So it's, you have Rome, from which there comes even into our own hands the true authority. Now, there's two ways you can understand that. You can understand it the way that Irenaeus said, that Rome is the preeminent authority in knowing what the apostolic tradition is, the truth that was handed down from the apostles. Or he's talking about where he is in Carthage, where the authority of Rome was, what, they were under Rome's guidance and authority. They were under the shepherding of the bishops and elders of Rome. They had their own elders, but they had a bishop who oversaw not just Rome, but also Carthage and a lot of the big churches that were west of Rome as well, like Irenaeus's church in Lyon, Gaul. Okay, so Rome, okay, the true authority. How happy is its church, on which apostles poured forth all their doctrine along with their blood, where Peter endures a passion like his Lord's, where Paul wins his crown and a death like John's, where the apostle John was first plunged unhurt into boiling oil, and thence remitted to his island exile. See what she has learned, what taught, what fellowship has had with even churches in Africa. The hour is added, but it makes a good point. Tertullian's in Africa, right across the Mediterranean Sea from Italy, and they've had fellowship with Rome, and Rome has had fellowship with them. So anyway, then he goes on to talk about the true teachings. You see Virgin Mary here. It really catches your eye, but they're just saying that Christ Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. So no heresies about Mary yet. Those things don't come along till well after the year 1000 and papal bulls, which there was no such thing as a papal bull in this time when Tertullian was writing this. So anyway, I've covered a lot of stuff. I hope this has been worth the time, because I've addressed things that I think are really beneficial for a Christian to know. Oh, I mentioned Cyprian, who also wrote from Carthage, 70 years later, exchanging letters with the elders in Rome. One of the things that the elders in Rome said in a letter to Cyprian was, we have a great church. We have, so much has been given to us. We got Peter, we got Paul, we got all these people who've been here. The martyrs have gone to their reward here. This is, it's such fabulous. And it would be a great crime to fall from our greatness. So, okay, they weren't going, the Holy Spirit will preserve the apostolic truth through the Pope. No, they were going, we can fall away, and it would be a great crime. And that's what happened. And it was a great crime. And for the Pope now to go, hey, you need to listen to me, because Peter was appointed, Peter showed up and was an elder in Rome, and surely the head elder, the bishop in Rome. And so therefore you ought to listen to me. That's nonsense. you would first have to prove, one, that you hold to the tradition that was taught by the apostles back in the days of, the stuff that I'm reading to you. And two, you would have to show a lineage, and your lineage is so messed up. It is so messed up. So many people remove, you've got no argument left anymore. Apostolic succession was an apologetic argument used in writings that were against the Gnostics. They were against heresies. They were arguments. They weren't written to the church. Irenaeus, Tertullian didn't write to the church and go, hey, you guys, you need to know about apostolic succession. Irenaeus did write to the church in Rome and goes, you need to know about apostolic succession. They probably already did, but his point was to go, you have to employ this as an argument against the heretics. I'm teaching you how to argue against heretics. I'm not teaching you about church doctrine. We all already know you have to hold to the apostolic tradition. You can't change it. You have to believe what the apostles handed down once for all to the church. That's Jude chapter. Jude only has one chapter. That's verse 3 in Jude, by the way, that we are to contend earnestly for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. So that's what I'm trying to do. There is a spot in here and in well, look at the Apostolic Tradition video. I do read you a statement of faith from Irenaeus in the Apostolic Tradition video. Thank you for bearing with me, especially this long, and I hope that it's as beneficial as I think it was. Thank you so much.